you can always DM me at any of the popular social media there. I'm Tamron Tech Jeff, pretty much across the board, all one word. And so we'll get started here. And birds in flight doesn't necessarily, as you can see by my title slide here, doesn't have to be a close-up of a single bird with all nice and sharp. It can be birds flying in the landscape, as this one was. And I think I'll bring this one up again later in the presentation, talk a little bit more about the circumstances there. But first I want to talk about knowing your camera, because that's the most important thing. If you can get to the point where you are as familiar with your camera as you are with your car, you know, you get in the car, you start driving, you put the key in the ignition, or if you got a really new car, you press that start button and you take off, and pretty much everything is second nature to you because you do it so often. You can reach and turn on the radio or turn it off, or adjust the heat or air conditioning, use your turn signal, and I hope you use your turn signal. But it's all second nature. As you're driving, you know, you keep your hands on the wheel, you're watching the road, and all the other ancillary things you do are because you know where everything is located. So get that familiar with your camera. If you're new to adjustable camera photography, you know, you may be on that auto or A mode, and it can be your best friend. You just don't want it to you don't want to let it be your best friend forever, because the camera is a dumb instrument. You have to give it instructions. You have to give it input as to how you want it to see things. Otherwise, you know, if you leave it in those auto modes, you can end up with perfectly exposed blurs. So you can graduate from auto to program. Program gives you a teeny bit of control, but where the meat and the potatoes of controls are in scene modes. And again, as you're first learning, you have scene modes that you'll have like a little icon that'll show up as you adjust the camera to those scene modes. That might be like a running man, and that would be for action shots. And that would be great for bird photography. You might have a little head and shoulders, which would be great for portraits. You might have a mountain, which would be great for landscape, and so on and so forth. And again, you can use those, and then you can go back and review the data. Your camera records all the exposure data, and you can review that after the fact, either when you download it or just on the view screen on the back of the camera, so that you know it picked a certain shutter speed and aperture and ISO for that scene. And again, you may or may not have gotten a good result. If you've gotten a good result, then you start to learn those things, so that when you get into shutter priority, which is probably mainly what you'll use with birds, or aperture priority, which I mainly use for landscape or portraiture, or manual, and of course everybody's a photographer until you get to manual. Those sorts of things are all useful to you, and the more you know about it, and the more you know where those controls are in your camera and how to adjust them, the more comfortable you're going to be in the field, and that's the important thing. So when we get out in the field and we start shooting, again, controlling those camera settings are paramount. This isn't exactly a bird in flight; it's a snowboarder in flight up at Tahoe. And we were doing some shooting sessions up there, both stills and videos of snowboarders coming off the jump. Now, for the still shots, as you can see, it was a pretty bright sunny day, no clouds in the sky, so the light values were going to remain the same all day. So we went to manual exposure. So that was one less thing that we had to worry about on the camera. We determined that we were going to need a shutter speed of thousandth of a second, and that was going to be adequate to stop the motion of the snowboarder coming off the jump. We knew that we needed a lot of depth of field, so we went to a small aperture, and I'll explain more about all these things and how they work shortly. And we went to f/16, so that we're able to carry with that 24 millimeter focal length we were using on a full frame camera. We're able to get that full depth of field, everything from near foreground out to infinity, as you can see in the frame is in focus. And then to get the further to dial in the correct exposure, we adjusted our ISO and ended up at that particular situation of ISO 800, so that we got the snowboarder properly exposed. You could see details in their clothing, you can see details in the trees, and they're all not just silhouettes. So again, knowing how the camera works allows you to be able to make those adjustments and those decisions. We made those decisions long before the first boarder slid down the hill. So that's important to know that. Also, that sunburst, I get some questions about that. Um, be careful when you're photographing with the sun in the viewfinder, especially if you have an optical viewfinder. It can do damage to your vision. So I usually use the electronic view screen on the back of the camera and go to live view if I've got the sun in the shot. Also, you want to be careful with the sun because again, it can burn holes it can damage your sensor, it can damage your shutters. So have the sun in the scene sparingly. But to get that nice sunburst that you see there, that starburst, that's simply a matter of stopping the lens way down. Now, Tamron lenses in particular, and a lot of other brands as well, have what we call circular aperture diaphragms, so that when the f-stops or when the diaphragm stops down, it creates a circular effect. And by doing that, at smaller apertures, f11, f16, f22, if the lens goes that far, you can get that nice sunburst effect. If you can even obscure the sun slightly behind something, and it'll actually enhance the subject, and you won't necessarily get that lens flare that you see in that shot. So we'll start off with aperture, and aperture again is a little less of a concern when you're shooting birds. You're probably going to want to isolate the bird, but and use higher shutter speeds, of course. But it's important to understand aperture, and it's a little counterintuitive again, especially if you're new to photography. Or as a refresher for you, again, the small numbers represent the large apertures, the large volume of light coming through the lens that's going to hit your sensor, which allows you a higher shutter speed and a smaller f-stop or a lower ISO, I should say. And most of our popular lenses, even if you have like an all-in-one kit lens that came with your camera, you may not be able to go beyond 5.6. That's still what we consider a fairly large aperture, and it'll allow you to isolate the subject from the background. And here's kind of an example of that. This flower, again, not a bird in flight, but a great example. We focused on the flower and kept the focus on the flower in all these shots, but as we stopped down from a large aperture to a smaller aperture, now nothing is moving the scene. We're not concerned with shutter speed or ISO particularly. So again, a low ISO here is going to be great to give you the maximum color saturation. But as we stop down, you can see that that piece of garden furniture in the background starts to become annoying, even at 5.6, but especially when you get to f11, f16, f22 is in that final frame there. All of a sudden, it's starting to take the viewer's eye away from the intended subject or the subject that we wanted to emphasize. So sometimes good depth of field is great, like in that previous shot of the snowboarder. Sometimes too much depth of field is a bad thing, and for a lot of shooting situations, you're going to want that larger aperture, either to isolate the subject or also, again, in the case of bird photography, to help you maintain a high enough shutter speed for capturing a bird in flight. So with that, we'll move to shutter speed. I'm going to take a sip of tea here. Thank you. And again, it's more straightforward here. We measure shutter speed in fractions of a second. So, 1/125th of a second is just that. 1/500th, 1/1000th, of course, there, the larger number is going to mean the faster the shutter speed, that smaller the smaller amount of time the shutter is open. And so that gives you the ability to stop things in motion. For example, and you may want to grab your camera or do a screen grab if your computer allows that. These are some good starting points for shutter speed for different kinds of motion or lack of motion. If your subject is sitting still, you may be able to get away with 125th or down to a 60th of a second. This is somewhat focal length dependent too. The longer your focal length, the higher you're going to need to have a shutter so that you don't have any shake induced from just from the magnification of the lens. But as a good starting point, 60th to 125th of a second. If the subject is moving slowly, maybe up to a 250th, a bird soaring at 250th to a 500th of a second, and in flight at a 500th, you'll still have some motion in the wingtips, which you'll see in my next frame. But here the bird was kind of gliding in, and at 1,000th of a second, even though it was still flapping its wings, even those small feathers out at the edge of the wing, which are moving very fast, are frozen in motion. So again, you may need to get up to 1,000th of a second or beyond. The smaller the bird, the faster those wings flutter and vibrate. I was out in the garden a week or so ago trying to capture some bees hopping from flower to flower, and I had to get up to around a 2,000th to a 4,000th of a second on my camera to freeze their wings in motion, or to have just a little motion blur. So the smaller the subject, the more that motion blur is going to be evident. But again, here with with an eagle in flight, it had just taken off from a tree. It spotted something, and it was headed to maybe capture its morning brunch. This was mid-morning, and as you can see, it was a very gray, dull, overcast day. So the contrast is fairly low, and it's a little bit noisy. But I was panning with the eagle. I had a 500th of a second, and I was already at ISO 1600 because it was such a dark morning. I was shooting wide open at f6.3 on the 150 to 600, and you still get that little bit of motion blur right out at the wingtips. Now I was panning with it, I was following the bird, I was keeping it in the frame where I wanted it, so the eye, the beak, the torso, and the interior of the wings near the shoulders are all nice and sharp. But where they're really moving fast, those feathers out at the end of the wings, you have that motion blur. Now I kind of like that effect. Again, it's up to you as to whether you want that fully frozen wingtip or whether you want a little motion blur, and that's kind of up to you. Now, also, it's not always about high shutter speeds. Tamron does a lot of workshops at birding festivals, and this is at the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Reserve. They have a big week-long birding festival every November, except sadly it's already been canceled for this year because of ongoing virus concerns. But you know, you're out there for several mornings, you know.
Hey, Jeff. I don't know if you know, but we can't hear you right now.
Jeff, we lost you. Stand by, folks. All right. I think Jeff will be returning to us from his iPad. There he is. Jeff, can't hear you.
Okay.
There we go. Now we can.
Okay. We're back?
We're back.
Oh. Hey.
Well, that was fun.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, you know, I have my iPad turned on in case something like this happens. Now I'm back on my computer, and we will go back to sharing here. Okay, you should be seeing that again, I hope.
We'll let you know. Can't see anything yet.
Okay.
There we go.
All right, bingo.
All right.
So, as I was saying, you're shooting for days and days and days, and you've got hundreds, thousands, maybe by this time in the middle of the week, tens of thousands of really great, sharp, crisp photos of birds in flight. And your creativity is starting to wane, and you think, well, what can I do that's different? So here, and we often shoot on a tripod whenever we can, and this was that situation. I was using the 100 to 400 millimeter lens, and on a tripod, and using a gimbal head to follow the birds, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But you finally say, what happens if I slow the shutter speed down and leave the camera stationary? So you can see those sandhill cranes at the bottom of the frame, and they're just wandering around in the wetland. They haven't decided to take off, but somebody's fired that starting gun for all these snow geese to take off. And as you can see, there's hundreds of them just in this frame and thousands of them on either side outside the frame. And at a 15th of a second, you get this really cool motion blur with that nice static in the bottom. Those sand hills and the wetland at the bottom of the frame are kind of holding everything together and acting as an anchor or a base. So it's not always about just freezing a bird or two or single birds in flight. Sometimes you want to experiment like that. Other times, there we go. This was at another birding festival, and
Did we lose him again?
Yeah, it certainly seems like it. Uh-oh. Technical difficulties today.
No kidding. All right. Stand by, everybody.
can you hear me now?
You can hear. There you are.
Okay,
Yes.
so I'm going to take a moment to get my iPad ready to go here for
All right. Bathroom break, everybody.
yeah, sorry. We're professionals, don't try this at home. Oh boy.
It's just the Murphy's Law of
Yeah.
webinars.
If you do it long enough, you're eventually going to have a glitch or two, and I apologize. As I said to the group before we got started, this is Monday on a Tuesday. As I'm getting my screen back ready to share here. Come on, there we go. I see a question about long lenses for the Micro Four Thirds mount, the Olympus OMD, and unfortunately at the moment, the longest lens we have is a 14 to 150. So it's a good all-purpose lens, and it may be good for sunbird photography, but might not be the ultimate one to use. So looks like we're back on the screen here. Ben, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, just making sure. So back to this shot, and again, I apologize. Here we do these festivals, and we're out before sunrise so that we're catching the birds as they take off from their roost in the morning. And this was in Florida, had a fantastic sunrise, and it was still pretty dark, great color in the sky. I shot this with the 28 to 75 millimeter on a full frame Sony lens or Sony camera. And here my intention was to get the birds in the landscape, in the environment. So again, not always about freezing that bird in flight, in motion. Sometimes you want to show them in their environment, show them in the landscape. And this one's also kind of funny because we got to shooting the birds, and about 30 minutes later, a huge deluge thunderstorm came through. It was tornado warned. Fortunately, the tornado ended up hitting about 10 miles away. But pay attention to the weather when you're out photographing birds too, because that's something you need to be aware of. Weather conditions, in the spring and the fall. Or at the summertime too, can change rapidly. So you want to be aware of what's going on when the weather changes, and take shelter if need be. So we'll move on to understanding ISO. Now that's your camera's sensitivity to light. Um, all digital cameras have an electronic sensitivity to light that you can adjust up and down. And the lower numbers, again, represent the best quality, the least sensitivity, but you're going to get the best color saturation, the least amount of electronic noise. And then as you go up into higher and higher numbers, you'll find that you get it's a noisier photo. If you're using a good sharp lens and you have a good sensor, it may still be sharp, and you'll see some examples as we move on when those sorts of things happen. So that's important also to pay attention to. Use the lowest ISO you can for the shooting situation, but in certain shooting situations, the low ISO may be a very high ISO to get the shot. This night sky photo required an ISO of 3200 to get the exposure correct. So use the lowest ISO you can, and I recommend, again, maybe trying auto ISO if you're shooting manual exposure. I generally, with night skies, I'll shoot a fixed ISO because I don't want any variables. Once I determine what my exposure needs to be, I'll pretty much stay with that. But the lowest ISO possible is going to give you the best results. Now, you may want to go out and experiment with your camera. And, pardon me, also seasonal allergies. And maybe go out and take some test shots with your camera and shoot at the lowest ISO, 50 or 100 or 200, whatever it happens to be, on the low end of your camera, and then shoot at 400 and go a stop or two up, maybe 8 or 1600, and then go to some of the higher ISOs, maybe 3200, 6400 and beyond, and come back and review them on your computer screen, or better yet, maybe make some 8x10s either on your printer at home or bring them into Looking Glass. They have a great photo lab there, and they can make prints and enlargements for you as well. And determine, from those prints, how high an ISO you're comfortable with before it starts to get too noisy, too grainy, not sharp enough, so that you know your comfort level with your camera. If you have more than one camera, again, try it with different cameras, because it can vary. Even if you have the same brand, two different models can have dramatically different high ISO sensor capability. We'll also talk a little bit about stability. I mentioned a few moments ago tripod and gimbal head. Again, you can talk to the professionals at Looking Glass, and they have a huge selection of tripods, gimbal heads. Which gimbal head allows you smooth tilting and smooth panning, and they're great for shooting birds in flight. Most serious birders are going to have a pretty big stable tripod and a gimbal head of some sort, just for smoothing out that motion as they're panning. Especially if you're shooting video, it gives you some very smooth movement, right and left and up and down. You don't get any sort of jerking motion. When you're using a tripod, you probably want to turn off the stabilizer. Now, experiment again with either in-body stabilization or with your with a stabilized lens. What works best in your shooting situation? Go out in the backyard and practice, and see if you can shoot successfully on a tripod with the stabilizer on. If your lens has a panning mode, as some of the Tamron and other brands of lenses do. Again, you'll find this mostly in telephoto lenses. You may be able to leave that on as you're panning left and right if your birds aren't going up and down a lot, and still be able to get some benefit from stabilization. The other tool you see there in that shot is a monopod, and a monopod can really be your best friend. If I'm out shooting, I will always take my monopod with me all through.
Oh boy.
Jeff, we lost you on the audio again.
All right, bear with us, everybody. I have a feeling Jeff will be moving to his iPad pretty soon here.
Can you hear me again?
We can hear you again,
Oh,
and we
boy.
can see you.
Okay. Now I don't know what's happening. I guess it's because I live out in the country, although most of my neighbors have gone back to work.
Yeah, it could be. I don't know. Maybe it's just
Any number of
connections. Maybe an
things.
off day. Yeah.
So again, I apologize to those of you for this scenario happening. I'm going to join with my iPad here.
If anybody didn't take a bathroom break the first time, maybe now is a great opportunity to take your bathroom
Indeed.
break.
Oh, there we are. So I
So
have the
much,
iPad.
Jeff Allen.
Yeah. So I have the iPad turned on so that we may have to hand over hosting duties to that device if this goes crazy again on me, and that way we can proceed. But in the meantime, we will we will marshal on here. And back to photos. Okay.
All right, we are good.
So again, the monopod takes all the stress off of your back and neck and shoulders, and especially if you're out shooting for long periods of time in any sort of event, birding or sports, or at your kids or grandkids games and things like that. When we get back to whatever the new normal is, a monopod can be a really helpful tool just in saving the strain on your back from having to be kind of crouched over and holding the camera up to your face all the time. So a very handy tool to have. And if it allows me, we'll move on to exposure compensation here. This is an important thing too. The shot that you see here looks great, but it's actually a camera's worst nightmare because you've got a fairly dark subject, a little off center, so your light meter may not be seeing that subject centered, and a very bright reflective background. And what you have happen is the camera's light meter sees all that bright and thinks, oh, it's very bright, I've got to stop down, I need a small aperture, or short shutter speed, and what you can end up with is a great silhouette of your subject. And if that's not what you're intending, you need to learn about your exposure compensation. So this will be an analog dial. It might be a plus minus button. There might be an LCD readout somewhere on the top or the back of the camera. This is a good thing also to either pick up your owner's manual and read where exposure compensation is, or if you're a more visual learner, the camera body makers all have great tutorials, usually on specific models of cameras, or at least on groups of cameras. So you're going to be able to go to for their YouTube channels, for instance, and you can probably find exposure compensation and learn how to use it on your camera. And sometimes that's a little more descriptive and an easier way to learn than trying to read your owner's manual. But basically, what you want to do is learn. Again, this is a great thing to experiment with your camera. Go out in the backyard or go to the park or someplace nearby and play with that exposure compensation and just shoot the same scene first with what your meter thought was correct, and then maybe to go to a -1 or a -2 setting. Some cameras will even go to -3 or 4, and then go to a +1 or 2 or 3 or 4 again if your camera offers that, and go back or just even review on the screen. But when you get home on your computer, review those and see what those different scenes look like, so you know how your camera's meter is going to behave, and you'll know when you need to maybe if you have a backlit or a spotlit subject with a backlit subject, when you need to go to those plus settings, +1, +2 or beyond, or if you have a very spotlit subject, a bright subject with a dark surrounding, then you need to go to those minus settings so that the camera doesn't overexpose your subject. So again, that's an important thing to get familiar with, learn where those controls are, and be comfortable with those when you're out in the field. So with that, let's get out experiment with your lens. Zoom in, zoom out. If you're using a prime or fixed lens, move your feet, or do that with your zoom lens as well. And don't always shoot your scene from your normal standing height. Maybe you want to get a little bit higher. I carry a step ladder with me for some shooting situations. I'll also carry a tarp and some knee pads, and I'll get down on the ground and get very low to the ground and shoot maybe straight across or up at a subject, just to change those different fields of view and points of view, and zoom in, zoom out, show the subject, change your composition, in its environment, or again, close up, and play with your depth of field to adjust where you want your subject's emphasis to be. Composition basics, it's known kind of in teaching as the rule of thirds. I kind of am starting to call it these are compositional suggestions rather than rules. But the rule of thirds is you want to try and put something in your scene if you can at about a third of the way in from the top or the bottom or the left or the right, and we call those anchor points or power intersections. And if you can get something close to that 1/3 in and 1/3 from the top or the bottom, you're going to make for a more interesting photo that allows the viewer's eye to linger longer. Psychology has proven that we like to see things in groups of 3. We like to see leading lines where there's something that brings the viewer's eye up to the subject or into the center of the frame, and those sorts of things all help make for a stronger photo that's going to give you more of what you're hoping to have the viewer look for in the frame. So when you get out in the field, you want to know your location, know where you can and can't go. Don't climb over fences, don't trespass, stay on the trails where it's recommended you do so. You don't want to make park rangers or your fellow citizens angry at you as you're out enjoying your hobby. And so again, just, be kind, and, if you pack it in, pack it out. And also know your subject. Read about the kinds of birds that are in your area, or where you're going if you're traveling. Know what their habits are. Know where they roost, how they roost. These are cormorants. Some of them are still flitting along the water there. As you can see, this was kind of a neat thing with a longer shutter speed. And then the ones that are up in the tree are, again, nice and sharp and solid. And they roost up in these cottonwood trees that are actually, this is like a few minutes from my house. I was just out looking at them last night, and that's exactly what they were doing at dusk. They were headed for the tree, but some of them were still playing in the water. So know those kinds of things. So know where they roost, know where they take off from in the morning, and you're going to have more success with finding the shots that you're trying to achieve. And sometimes it takes some practice and study and planning. And this is a shot that all of those things plus some luck became involved in this. Again, I have a lot of great blue herons that live near where I live, and I'd been going out in the afternoon, trying to catch them when they were hunting to bring food home and to have their own meals. And they were in a wetland area just right off of a busy county road. And every time my car would pull off and hit that gravel shoulder off of the pavement, that noise would sometimes spook the birds. It would change their behavior. Sometimes it even scared them off. So I knew that wasn't right. Again, if you're altering your subject's behavior, you're too close or you're making too much noise. So those sorts of things should be avoided also. So finally, after a few weeks of frustration and realizing that I was not being friendly to my subject, I got there one afternoon about a half hour earlier than I'd been going, and I discovered that the herons weren't there yet. So I was able to set up, get my exposure set, and as you can see, this is late afternoon, the sun's going down, the bird is very backlit, so I knew I was going to have to use my exposure compensation. So I did some test shots before the birds arrived and determined that I was going to need to be at a plus 1.3 on my exposure compensation. That particular day, I was using ISO 400, and I was using a 320th of a second shutter speed, and that gave me a fast enough shutter speed to, again, as the herons are gliding in, they tend for the for the last 50 or 100 feet or so, pardon me, they tend not to flap their wings. So I knew it was going to be more or less gliding and just guiding himself into his landing point. And again, I had some nice reflected light up off of those fallen cattails in the foreground, so I was able to illuminate the underside of the bird. And that blue color, of course, we know herons aren't that color; their wings are kind of a blue-gray color. That was just pure luck. Right at that moment, the way the bird's wings were flapping, I got the reflection of the blue sky off of the oils the natural oils in its feathers, and it gave me that kind of surreal blue look. And again, that's not Photoshop. That's just what happened in that particular frame at that particular moment. You have that nice backlight sun coming through its beak there, its bill, so that's fluorescing and making it a brighter orange than usual. But again, I was concentrating on sharp focus, keeping those eyes in focus. That's always very important. And again, I was panning with the bird. I zoomed out when I saw the birds flying in. I picked out one that I was hoping was going to land close to me, and got lucky with that. Also, my camera was in continuous autofocus. I was using a spot focus in this particular situation that I had just one notch off of the center. You can see the bird is not quite centered. And I was focusing on its kind of the large mass of the torso of the bird, which I was pretty sure was going to give me a sharp enough view of the eye, which it did. And I just started shooting in continuous frame advance, click, 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 click. And that allowed the camera to, in continuous focus, lock onto the birds as they were approaching. And I kept firing and firing and firing and following across. And and as it landed, this was kind of the keeper shot. So again, a lot of planning, a lot of shots that you don't see before and after this to get that one shot. So it's important to shoot a lot of images to get that one that's really going to stand out. And in the next frame here, this is kind of a Hitchcockian moment. This is back down at the Bosque del Apache Wildlife Preserve. And here, something else to know: birds, just like airplanes, take off and land into the wind. They use the wind. This is how humans learn to fly, by watching how birds flew. They take off into the wind. Now this morning, as you can tell, the wind was basically at my back, or the breeze was at my back. So when all of these snow geese decided to take off, it was straight at me. So here's another pro tip for photographing waterfowl like this: be sure and wear a hat, and be sure and wear kind of a waterproof jacket, because they're going to be dripping. And also, birds do what birds do when they first take off, which is, squirt a little bit out. Fortunately, I didn't get baptized by the birds other than with water that morning. But again, people around me were getting droppings on them, so to speak. So that's another thing to think about if you're shooting water birds like this. Now, lens comparison. This was shot with a 100 to 400, and I was reasonably close to the birds. You can see that big cottonwood tree in the background. Now, another day, and I don't remember whether this was the day before or the day after, I was shooting the 150 to 600. As you can see, we had a crossing wind there. The wind was kind of coming in from camera left, so they were taking off that direction. But I was much further away with the 150 to 600. Now, that previous shot was at about 150 millimeters on the 100 to 400. This one is at about 500 millimeters. And you can see that difference in how big the tree appears just with telephoto compression. So bear in mind, the more telephoto you use, the more compressed distant things are going to become, and the closer and larger background objects are going to appear in the shot too. So that's important to remember. Also think about what backgrounds are. Again, I talked about the rule of thirds. Now it isn't quite there, but again, that 1/3 of the frame, or the lower kind of left-hand third of the frame, that mountain is in the background. So you can use, if you're shooting single birds, maybe something such as the landscape in the background to add interest or to break up the scene a little bit. There's still plenty of negative space above and to the right of the animal, but again, that just helps make the shot a little more interesting looking. Now, sometimes you're going to get lucky, as with this osprey. We were, again, this was back in Florida, and we found this family of 5 or 6 osprey that were circling a pond and diving down and catching a fish and taking them back off to the nesting area. So again, I was using my time I was using a small group focus where again, I can position the focus points in the viewfinder, and this is something you'll want to experiment with in your camera. Different cameras, most all cameras are going to have a single spot that you can usually move wherever you want in the viewfinder using that control wheel that's under your thumb, or that control rocker that's under your thumb. And I will almost never have it center spotted unless it's just a last resort and I'm shooting, again, smaller birds where I want to try and get them in the center of the frame and crop later. But I try and do as much cropping in camera as possible. So again, a little offset, kind of in that right hand, if you will, third of the frame. And birds in flight especially, you want to give them a little space to fly into. You'll notice in that sandhill, again, there was space that it was flying into. And the same thing with this osprey. Give a little bit more space in the direction that the animal is flying, if you can, to, again, it creates a psychologically more pleasing composition to the eye. Different times of day are also going to make for different looking light. The light in the morning tends to be a little softer. You're going to get that color, that warm color of light, because the sun is coming through particulate matter in the air, of course. I have found, generally speaking, and this is also why hot air balloons tend to launch in the morning and not in the afternoon, the winds are lower typically in the morning. Now, again, this is somewhat weather dependent. Watch the weather forecast and look for wind forecasts too. But the light tends to be a little softer in the morning, a little harsher and a little contrastier in the afternoon, because dirt and dust and more particulate matter have been stirred up, both because of human activity and because of wind. So you tend to get a little crisper, harsher looking light in the afternoon than you sometimes do in the morning. Now, also different things here. The morning shot on the left-hand frame, the sun was basically right at my back, or almost right at my back, whereas it's a more crossing light, a more portrait type light here on the right-hand frame. So again, look for the light, think about where it's coming from, and if you can adjust yourself left or right to make the light more interesting in your frame. And again, when you're out in nature, you can't always go a long distance right or left to get to the good light, but look for the good light as much as you can as well. Sometimes, again, for smaller birds, it may be better to catch them in the trees. This little guy is the smallest of the falcons, and a tiny bird, not a whole lot bigger than a robin. And it's really fast, and it's gonna take off and fly in a hurry. So I try and catch smaller birds like this as they're roosting or waiting and looking, as in the case of raptors like this, looking for where the next meal might be scurrying around on the ground that they're going to hop and take off and fly off and catch. And a few minutes after I made this shot, this little fella took off, and I didn't get any really good shots of it in flight. Plus, because of where I was positioned, most of the shots I got were from it flying away from me. And again, you'll learn in bird photography, as you're catching birds in flight, you're gonna get a lot of birds behinds, birds butts. So those will end up maybe in the discard piles. But again, keep firing, keep shooting even after they take off. Now, again, much higher shutter speed to get these small animals like this in flight too. Here's another great example of this, and here's also where I used custom white balance. This bird was under a tree canopy, and if you don't custom white balance, and again, the folks at Looking Glass can explain to you more about how to do custom white balance in your camera. They probably sell a number of different devices that you can use to get the best custom white balance. But the problem is, if you're shooting under a tree like this and you leave your camera in auto white balance, you're going to end up with a green overall color cast to the shot, and you want to show off the natural colors of the animal. So by custom white balancing, you balance out and customize or compensate for any color cast you might have like that. Now, here's kind of the craziest thing in my presentation. There is a Kensington Park out in suburban Detroit actually sells bird seed at the gift shop at the park and encourages people to go out and hold bird seed out in their hands and let the small birds actually land in their hand and eat the bird seed right out of their hand. I don't know how I feel about this. It's what they do, and apparently it's a decades old tradition, so they're probably not going to change it. And the birding and wildlife photographers in that area have come to love it. We were leading a workshop. I didn't really realize this was happening the first time I went, but I was prepared the next time. And this was one of our workshop attendees who was shooting with a wide angle lens, just kind of crazily trying to get shots of the birds as they landed in his hand there. So just kind of a fun thing to think about. If the birds in your neighborhood are comfortable enough with flitting up to you, maybe you can do that. Again, I recommend probably, if you're serious about backyard bird photography, maybe setting up some bird feeders in your backyard and proceeding like that, rather than trying to get them acclimated enough to you to land in your hand. But again, time for another conversation. This is, again, I mentioned when you get deep into shadows, this is another ISO, high ISO shot. I was up to ISO 3200 with this particular image of this woodpecker, and this is also cropped about 60 or 70% from the original frame. It was originally shot horizontally. I thought the vertical composition was better, and you'll notice on your screen it probably looks kind of speckled, especially in the underexposed or just off highlight areas, like in those leaves in the background. And you see that video noise that you get from high ISO and cropping, but the image is still sharp. So again, this is one of those situations where if you know how your camera is going to perform, you can know how high an ISO you can go, still be able to crop if you need it and get a sharp picture. Now, again, granted, it's noisy, and I didn't dial in the custom white balance as precisely as I could have here. There's a little color shift, which also happens more noticeably at high ISOs, but I got the shot. And sometimes, again, the tools at hand can really help you a lot. Tamron and many other manufacturers build stabilization into their lenses, and a lot of the newer mirrorless cameras actually have stabilization built in to the camera body, so you can take advantage of shake reduction in this regard. I was shooting at 400 millimeters handheld at 125th of a second here, and the rule of thumb before stabilization was common, and this was a grab shot. I didn't have time to throw the camera on a monopod or a tripod because I figured the hawk would fly away, which it did, again, seconds after I made this photo. Stabilization can really help you in those low light situations. This was probably 20 minutes after sunset. I was up to ISO 800 here. I was at 400 millimeters, and I wanted a little depth of field for focus, for protecting my any focus error I might have made. And I was down to 125th of a second, and everything is nice and sharp because of image stabilization. So take advantage of those technologies too. Although I will say, anytime you can, shoot off of a monopod or a tripod, it will help give you sharper pictures. Now, as I mentioned, on a tripod, you'll probably want to turn your stabilization off. On a monopod, I generally leave my stabilization turned on. So experiment with your camera and lens combination and your support situation to see what works best for you. Now, another situation you'll run into is bad weather. At the Bosque wildlife festival last fall, it rained for the first 2 days, and that really, no pun intended, put a damper on things. People couldn't really get out and get shots of the animals. The birds were hunkered down. They weren't flying. They weren't doing much of anything. But on the third morning, we woke up and I looked out my hotel window 2 hours before sunrise, and I couldn't see from my hotel window to the far side of the parking lot at the hotel. It was so foggy, and I thought, well, this could be very interesting. And so we got out to the preserve. I met up with the little group that I was leading, and we were shooting photos. And I was explaining, this is magic, mystical light. Don't stop shooting. And I could hear other groups of photographers who were either individuals or with other trip leaders, and people were just grousing and complaining about, oh man, this is horrible. I'm not ever going to get a sharp picture of a bird all week. And I was telling my group, take advantage of this magic light. Yes, it's harder to focus. You're going to have to manually focus. Yes, you're going to need a higher ISO. This picture was shot at ISO 3200, but because the contrast is so low, you don't see that noise in the photo so much. And I was also on a monopod at 100th of a second at 600 millimeters on the lens, almost completely wide open at f7.1. So I was just a third of a stop down from its largest aperture. So again, I have those two birds in the foreground, nice and sharp, and between the fog and the bokeh in the background, they just fall off nicely into that mist. And the people in my workshop came back and were going, I can't believe the wonderful shots I got. I was hoping for sharp pictures, but I got these, and I'm just as happy. So again, keep shooting even if the weather is bad. Now here's the fog lifted a little bit, and some of the geese started to take off. Again, still in that mist, so you get that kind of ethereal look. So don't be afraid to get out in bad weather and fog and things like that and shoot. You're going to get interesting, printable results. Here I found, this was like an hour later, we found where the geese were actually going to start foraging for the day. And I caught a couple as they were landing. Again, you'll notice I'm using that suggestion or rule of thirds, and they're in that right-hand third of the frame. And I have some anchor at the bottom and some negative space on the left-hand side of the frame. So keep those things in mind compositionally when you're out shooting. I also had a lens that Tamron hadn't even started selling at that point with me. I had the brand new, it's available now, 24 millimeter for the Sony full frame mirrorless cameras. And so I was shooting not only my telephoto lenses, but I had another body. I had three bodies over my shoulders. So I was walking around like hunched over at the end of the day anyway. But I picked up the wide angle as these sandhills were taking off, and I used that tree as the anchor point with the birds in the frame. And it, again, just makes for something a little different to think about. Now, as I wrap up here, again, don't forget those really high-flying birds. I have apps on my phone that tell me when the International Space Station is going to fly over, for instance. And so I was doing night sky photos, and the app told me the space station will be coming up in 10 minutes. So I was shooting the other direction, kind of catching the Milky Way as it was starting to rise. What you see here, that dome of light in the center of the frame, is the light dome over Cheyenne, Wyoming, which was about 60 or 70 miles away from me, where I was shooting out in northeastern Colorado. And on the lower left-hand corner there, again, 2 hours after sunset, but there was still that much light over the horizon that I couldn't see, but in a 30-second exposure, which this was, the camera still picked that up. So your camera can see a lot of things in the dark that you can't see. Now, here's the rule of thumb for doing night sky. You want to divide your focal length into 500, and that'll give you the number of seconds that you can shoot and still have pinpointed stars. So with the 15 to 30 millimeter lens, at 15 millimeters, I was able to shoot 30.333 was the math. So I did a 30-second exposure. And for that 30 seconds, that's how far the space station traveled through my frame at 17,500 miles away at about 150 miles above me. You can also see down there a little bit below the space station, that small streak, I think, is a meteor that was entering the atmosphere. And then above Cheyenne, you can see in the very far distance a plane with its lights kind of above Cheyenne, moving horizontally across near the bottom of the frame. So kind of a fun thing to do. Don't put the camera away after dark, because there's still great things to shoot in the night sky too. Another little tool I recommend, in addition to tripods and monopods, would be a polarizing filter. And a circular polarizer, again, you can attach to the front of your lens. It rotates, and you can see through the viewfinder what you're getting. But especially with birds around water, polarizers reduce the reflected glare off of water and grass and tree leaves and rocks, anything but metal, basically. So you're going to get, you're going to be able to see through water almost. You're going to reduce that glare. It makes the clouds stand out against the sky. I think it's a really handy tool to have, especially not so much early morning, late afternoon, but when you're shooting midday, a very handy tool to have in your camera bag. And it works at right angles to the sun. So think of that. Your best results are going to be kind of when the sun is over your shoulder. And again, because you can see the effect through the viewfinder, as you rotate it, you're going to be able to see the effect you wanted. You can minimize or maximize or set somewhere in between, but very handy for water birds too. So that about wraps up the presentation. We made it through with a couple of minor technical glitches. Again, if we don't get to a question you might have for me, or if you think of something a little down the road later on, you can always drop me a direct message at any of my social media addresses there. I find that the Facebook and Instagram messages tend to come through right away. Sometimes I don't see Twitter messages for days for whatever reason. So again, if a question comes up that we don't get addressed, or you think of in a couple of hours or tomorrow or whatever, check in with me that way. Again, thank you so much for Looking Glass for hosting me today and putting up with my living out in the country and apparently my dropped internet signal there, which we were able to recover from. And we'll open up the floor for questions, and we hope some answers here too.
Oh, I'm certain that you've got all of the answers for us, Jeff. But yeah, let's jump off with the first, or most recent question we got here. The location for most of the waterfowl shots. This just came in toward the end, so it may have been some of those. If that was one location, is it multiple? And if it's multiple, pick your favorite.
Well, it was multiple locations all over the country. Now, like the great blue heron was in some wetlands 10 minutes from my house. I live in a little town outside of Fort Collins called Timnath, Colorado, and that's the edge of the Timnath Reservoir, the eastern edge. And there's some just fantastic wetlands out there that are reliable. I go out there a lot of afternoons during the week when I can socially distance myself from the house. And I go out there regularly. A lot of the cranes and snow geese were at a wildlife reserve down in south central New Mexico, just off of Interstate 25. It's called Bosque de la Pache, and it's in San Antonio, New Mexico, which is about a half hour south of Socorro, which is about 2 hours south of Albuquerque, or about 3 hours north of Las Cruces, 4 hours north or so of El Paso, just to kind of put it into perspective along that Interstate 25 corridor. There were also several shots done in Florida at various birding festivals up and down the east and west coast of Florida. So I'm all over the country doing bird workshops on Tamron's behalf mostly. And so again, everywhere, anywhere you can find, wooded areas or wetland areas, you're likely to find birds.
Okay, great. I believe this was also a question from Jim, wanting to know, I guess just kind of in general, the rate at which you crop any of the images, let's just say the ones that you used in your presentation today, um, how often you crop, if the pictures that we're seeing in your presentation are altered at all, any kind of edits done to them, or if everything is about as raw as it can be coming straight out of camera.
It's almost all straight out of the camera. I do very little editing because I don't want to show off my Photoshop skills. I want to show off what the Tamron lenses are capable of. So other than the basic things, a little contrast, a little levels adjustments, which are going to be used mostly for the presentation, or for printing, like the images printed on the wall behind me. The woodpecker was cropped substantially. Again, that was about a 70% crop, but almost everything else was no more than a 10% crop out of the camera, just for fitting it into the frame better when I was putting the presentation together. So again, it's straight out of camera. I do as much in camera in the field as I can in terms of cropping it the way I want as best possible in the field, and of course getting the correct exposure, the correct color balance. In my workflow, I shoot both RAW and JPEG, so I have JPEGs that are finished. I can post right away if I need to, or upload to Tamron. Every once in a while I'll post something from a scene, and that night or the next morning I'll get an email from the office. Hey, saw those great pictures you posted yesterday. Why don't you send us a half a dozen more that we can use for social media? And if I have, I'm getting ready to go to my next event, and if I have JPEGs, I can pretty much just throw them in a folder and send them off to the office. If I have only RAW files, then I'm going to have to process them. I'm going to have to color correct them. I'm going to have to contrast correct them. I'm going to have to do whatever else I need to do with the RAW file, and then downsize them, because RAW files are huge, again, and then turn them into JPEGs in order to send them off to the office. So that's why I shoot both. So I have images that I can use immediately, and images that I can fine tune if I have to. But I use RAW mostly for recording all of the data, rather than for doing a lot of manipulation in post. Now there are times, again, I'm not a great Lightroom or Photoshop guru, so again, I'm showing off what the lenses can do more than what my post-processing skills are. I know that's a long answer to a short question.
No, it's great. Another question from earlier on regarding metering mode and exposure comp on some of there was a shot called out specifically, a shot of an osprey, and then some of the birds that followed that. Just a question on what, I guess, how you meter, what metering mode you're using, and then if you use exposure comp at all.
Yeah, I most of the time, I'm a Nikon shooter, so I use matrix metering, which in Canon's nomenclature would be the evaluative metering, where it's looking at a number of places in the screen and then averaging them together. But I use exposure compensation a lot. Now, again, this comes to being familiar with the cameras, and I shoot mostly Nikon. I have a Canon that I shoot occasionally, just so I can be familiar with answering questions when I'm teaching workshops. I also use some Sony cameras, and I find that the Nikons and the Sony meter very similarly. The Canon meters a little differently. Pardon me, but for the most part, it's that evaluative metering. Occasionally, I'll go to a center weighted or a spot if I know my subject is going to be spot lit or backlit, and the light conditions aren't going to change a lot. But I'll still rely on my exposure compensation, and I'll do a couple of test shots. Say, okay, looks like I need to bump it up 2/3 of a stop or a stop. Sometimes more than a stop. Or if I have something, a really bright subject against a dark background, I might go to the minus a little bit. But I rely on exposure compensation more so than anything else. And again, I don't rely heavily on looking at histograms when I'm out in the field. Because we were taught at some point, everybody wants that bell curve histogram. That doesn't happen in the real world very often. You're going to see exposure data stacked to the left or the right in a lot of shooting situations, and it's still the correct exposure for that situation. But what you want to look for if you are looking at your histogram is make sure that on the very far right or the very far left, you don't have those spikes that go all the way to the top, because that means that the exposure is clipping and you're losing either highlight data or shadow data, depending upon which side it hits. So, I will glance at the histogram once in a while, and if I'm seeing that it's clipping, I'll make those adjustments too.
Okay, awesome. I would say that answered that question very well.
Hope so.
And then a question here from Brian. Just wanted you to go back over the tips or techniques with catching birds in flight, which I know is probably a lot of folks' question. That's
Yeah.
It seems like the first thing that comes up whenever discussing birding photography. It definitely is a very important one. So.
Oh yeah. You'll notice that most of the birds in flight shots you saw were larger birds, and it's simply because they are easier. They fill the frame up better. It's easier for the camera to acquire focus on. But I learned bird photography, and I self-teach. I self-taught based on shooting small birds, starting in the backyard and going to the neighborhood park. And if you can, again, start to follow those small birds in flight, uh, I learned all this in the film days, so I was limited to 36 shots and having to either run in and process the film myself if it was black and white, or sometimes color slides, or run it off to the lab and wait for an hour or 24 hours or a week, depending upon, again, how far back in history you want to go for photo finishing, before I knew what my results were. And one of the beautiful things with digital is that now you can read all that recorded exposure information, and if the picture is sharp, you know that that's a good shutter speed, aperture, ISO combination to use. And if it's not sharp, you learn to build from there, what to adjust and how to adjust it through practice. But again, burst mode, so that when you press the button, the camera goes going click, 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 click. I am fortunate now, didn't always have this good fortune when I was starting. I started with a thumb wound film camera. So I was only able to shoot as fast as my thumb could advance, which is, maybe a frame every second and a half if I'm really cranking, to now I have cameras that will shoot at greater than 10 frames a second. So technology is a wonderful thing in that regard. And also with digital, buy, check with the folks at the store, and for your camera, tell them that you want to get the fastest write speed card that you can get for your camera. They carry a number of brands and read and write speeds of memory cards. And if you're doing nothing but landscape, you don't need high speed memory cards, and you can save a little bit of money. You'll spend a little bit more on high write speed, read write cards, and not so much reading, because that's downloading, but you want high write speeds because that's where the data is coming out of your camera and onto the card. I spend more money on high-speed cards so that as I'm firing away, I can go click, 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 and it all of a sudden doesn't start to go click, 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 click as I'm panning with my subject. And I've had card and camera combinations in the past where that's happened. And again, when you're thinking of investing in a new piece of equipment, if you're thinking on shooting fast-moving subjects, that's one of the things that you want to talk to the folks at the store about, in terms of getting the camera that's going to suit your needs best and obviously suit your budget the best, and also make that investment in good quality brand name cards that are going to have that high write speed that's going to match the output of your camera, so that you're not losing photos. And again, just practice, practice, practice. Pan with the subject. Try and keep the images centered in your frame as best you can. I think that's actually the answer to the question. Again, play with different shutter speed, aperture combinations to see what's going to work best in your environment. But just simply start in the backyard. Take bunch of pictures, download them, delete them if they're no good, and empty off your cards and start again. That's one of the beautiful things about digital that I didn't have in learning with film, is I can shoot hundreds or thousands of pictures in an outing, and I can discard all the ones that I'm not happy with, and keep the good ones, and also make prints of the good ones. These things behind me don't have an off switch. They make great gifts, and in terms of digital storage too. In 5, 10, 20 years, if you've been involved in personal computing for any length of time, if you started with floppies, you don't own a device that can read those floppies anymore. If you still even have floppies, they're in the hall closet, or they're in the basement, or they're in the attic. There's no way to retrieve that data. So prints give you an actual hard copy of something that your kids and your grandkids are going to be able to look at and enjoy, see what you were passionate about, and see what life looked like in the early 21st century. Hard drives crash. They get stolen out of your car. Not that I would have any experience with that.
It's true. He does. I know. I've
Yes.
heard about it. It
was,
really is unfortunate in that case, but
Yeah.
I will second that. Print is huge. I mean, even if it's just for yourself, but
Yeah.
I do the same. My room is littered with framed photos that I've taken all over the place, and often, especially if you can't think of any other good gift ideas for friends or family members, they
Absolutely.
always appreciate a good photographic print, because it's something that you made, and they know that's important to you. So
You're giving them a piece of your heart and soul.
there you go. You could really ham it up, sure.
That's right.
Any other last minute questions here before we wrap it up for this week? We'll give some people some time to maybe put some questions in there. But again, thank you guys all for attending the webinar today. We recorded it. We will send it, follow up with everybody, for anybody that was late to the meeting or didn't see it. And then we will definitely stay tuned. We'll have more of these kind of webinars going forward. So make sure you're on the Looking Glass mailing list. Jeff, we did have another question pop up here. Could you repeat the formula for setting ISO and focal length for night shots?
Yeah, sure. That's an easy one. Divide your focal length into 500, and that'll give you the number of seconds that you can have before the Earth's rotation starts to lose that pinpoint light. So again, like if you're using a 50 millimeter lens, you'd only be able to shoot 10 minutes. So wide angles are especially nice, where you can get those 15, 20, up to 30-second exposures before the Earth's rotation starts to create star trails rather than pinpoints. And again, I don't know if Looking Glass has hosted a night sky seminar. Tamron has those available too. If you have, I can see a thumbs up from Jen there. That's obviously a great workshop all in itself. But I hope that helps. And I'm seeing some thank yous, and keep up the presentations. We will. I'm working on more topics. Also, I just wanted to remind everybody, and Ben, you can expand on this too. Tamron right now has some great national rebates, savings on lenses up to $200 on some of our most popular lenses. And I think there might be a little something special for the folks who tuned in today.
That's right, Jeff. Sharon asking about that. She stayed with us long enough to find out what our special was, and that was in addition to the national rebates that Jeff just mentioned. Through Looking Glass for the next 5 days, you can get anywhere between $25 to $50 extra in bonus rebates. So how you would do that, and there'll be an email following up, reminding everybody about that. But you would call into the store. You would place your order. I think calling into the store is probably best, or emailing, and then just let them know that you were on the webinar presentation, and what you're looking for. Unfortunately, let me see, make sure. Dan, no extra rebates on the 70 to 180. The thing is so brand new.
Yeah, what are you, nuts?
It's I mean, but thank you for asking. You got
Yes.
what if you don't try? You'd never know. But that would be definitely it never hurts to ask. That's right.
That's right.
But I mean, it's still coming in well over $1,000 less than its competitors. So we put it on market already with a discount. But yeah, definitely follow up with Looking Glass if you guys are in the market for any lenses. If you have any further questions, they would have all the answers for those. Thank you guys. We appreciate all you guys for showing up. Just want to make sure that we didn't miss anything here. I think here's a question on teleconverters, which I think we could answer pretty easily. Teleconverters, Tamron makes two, a 1.4 and a 2. They can be used with the Tamron G2, 70 to 200 and 150 to 600 G2. Also with the 1 to 4, if I'm not mistaken. Jeff, is that correct?
Yes.
And then
sorry, I was reading questions and listening here.
But
sure.
yeah, because that last question I'm gonna leave to you, Jeff. But
Okay.
So the teleconverters, Tamron makes them. They work with the Tamron lenses, but
Yeah, the Tamron telephotos.
Tamron telephotos, but a lot of people, myself included for a long time, are not aware that teleconverters and lenses are brand specific. So you want to use a teleconverter for whatever your brand of lens is, be it, Tamron, Nikon, Canon. Swapping them usually does not work. But yeah, and then Jeff, I'll let you answer. Well, actually, that's plans to extend lenses to OMD. Haven't heard anything yet.
Yeah,
I wouldn't hold your breath, Hannah.
Yeah, unfortunately, first of all, the companies that are making the Micro Four Thirds mount have oodles of lenses. So there's not many niches that we could fill in beyond that. We do have that 14 to 150 all-purpose lens, and it's a great little lens. But we're a public company. Designs have to be taken to the board of directors, and one of the questions that gets answered is how many can we sell in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, the life expectancy of a lens. And because of market share right now, I know Micro Four Thirds is popular in the United States, but on a worldwide basis, they don't quite crack that 10% market share that our board has kind of set for what they think, we need to in getting a return on the investment of tooling up. It costs millions of dollars, even just to create lenses for the big three brands right now, or the big three mounts right now. And, we bring out fewer and fewer lenses if we start diluting what we're doing. So I don't have a real strong yes to that. It's a solid maybe if they bring up market share, but then we've got to figure out, what niches can we fit. Even if you look at the new Sony mount lenses that we've introduced, they kind of don't hit at the same focal lengths that are already out there, with the exception of the prime lenses. But the zooms are all slightly different than what has already hit the market. So it gives you choice, and it gives you, a price point to choose from as well. So it's a tough call. Don't know totally what to say. And yeah, no teleconverter for Sony mount yet. That's something they may look at as we start to add more telephotos to that mount.
Yeah, and we definitely, again, and I apologize. There's a parrot in my house who's being very vocal upstairs. So every time I go off mute, I hope he gets all of his everything he wants to say and all the noises he wants to make out of the system when I'm on mute. When they go off mute, start talking, that's usually when he starts thinking he needs to become audible again. We can also say that even with, I mean, so far, even with the coronavirus giving us a number of challenges and setbacks that for a lot of people, Tamron does still plan to release a few more lenses by the end of the year. So stay tuned. They are definitely going to be some hot items. And that is all that I'm going to say about that while it's being recorded.
Or even after.
Right, correct. I would not say anything after.
Oh.
Not ever. But yeah, so again, thanks everybody. Bonus rebates, national rebates if you're in the market for most lenses in the Tamron line. Any further questions, Jeff has given his information. You can ask him. I am also on Instagram. Tamron PNW would find me. Again, my name is Ben Hutchinson. And then, any other questions for on system or maybe other lenses or anything like that, can absolutely go through Looking Glass, and definitely stay tuned. We will have more and more of these webinars rolling out while it is safest to do webinars versus in-person classes and presentations and events. But thanks guys for all attending this week, and we will see you again soon. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah,
Thanks, Jen.
and shop local.
Shop local. Make
That's
prints.
right. Yep.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see
All right.
you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.